from the conference and the things you've heard and connecting. You two just kind of gave yours, but I'll let you all volunteer if anyone would like to start. Bring it together.
If I get to go first, then I get to take all the good points.
Smart.
I think a couple of things really stand out to me. First of all, is community. And I would take that a little bit further even and talk about the trust. You have to be willing to trust your neighbor. You have to accept that your neighbor trusts you. You have to go on faith a little bit as you sort of forge onward in the sort of sustainability movement, especially when it comes to food and community in general. We can't all hide out on our pieces of ground or in town, in our neighborhood or whatever, and say, well, I don't trust them, so I'm going to try to build this whole thing for myself, because that's really not sustainable. So I think there's a piece to this puzzle that I don't know exactly how we foster, other than to kind of lead by example, and that is to help one another whenever possible, accept help from other people, and even ask for it.
So all of that, and I'll just add 2 points really quickly. You're all taking a big chunk of your weekend to do this Saturday, and many of you took yesterday as well to do this. And clearly one of the major values of doing something like this is that we all learn from one another, which is the major currency in order to be able to do what we've just heard described, figure out sustainable ways of living on this planet. Our culture is the set of beliefs and behaviors that adapt us to the time and the place in which we live. Because time is always shifting. Even if we are in the same place, we're never encountering the same situations. And learning is the thing that makes the difference between failing in the situation that we're in and finding ways in which we can advance. And so that's the credit that I give everyone that has taken the time to be here and continue to learn and take a mistake in moving us forward.
Well, I probably provided as much bad news yesterday as anybody else in terms of our future challenges, and didn't have time to go into all of the good things. But let me just add 2 things, and it was kind of referred to here, I think. But one is that there is still a kind of culture out there that people who live in urban communities don't know anything about farming, and so we shouldn't listen to them. And that farmers don't know anything about people in urban communities, so we shouldn't listen to them. And the thing that we're missing in that, and there's some justification for those perspectives, but that era is rapidly coming to a close because we have a new culture that's emerging now, and I see this especially in some of our urban communities, and that is that people who used to just be recipients of food, passive recipients, are now becoming active engagement. They're what I like to call food citizens. And these are people who are very interested in understanding all of the challenges around our future food system and how we can work together to make that happen. And that's a culture we should not be ignoring. We should be participating in every way that we can. Because as has been mentioned at this conference so often, all of the challenges that we have to address together. And so continuing to have these divides between rural and urban, between farmers and people in different communities, etc., we just need to set that aside and become engaged. So that's one opportunity, I think. The other one is that, and I see this so much all across the country now, is that we have a new generation of young people. Most of us call them millennials. I don't even know if they like that term themselves. But, they're a different generation from my generation. Many of them want to farm. They're very aware of all the challenges we've talked about at this conference, and they know it's their future that's going to address them, and they want to find ways to do that. And they're becoming actively engaged. I don't know what the percentage is, but it could very easily be 20% by now. And if it's 20%, they're going to change the world. That's just where it's at. And again, we should be reaching out, working with them, supporting them as much as we possibly can. And that inspires me. And they're smart, they're dedicated, they're inspiring, and so those are two cultural kinds of things that we have the good fortune now of just being at the beginning of being a part of that. So even old guys like me can have some good times in the future as we work with these emerging new cultures.
I am Hattie, just spoke. So I would introduce myself again. Well, at the high tunnel, low tunnel session that I was a privilege to be in, they were talking about thousands of bushels an acre, and I was like, wow, that makes it sound like what I talk about, like a Charlie Brown tomato plant. Like we're not talking about the same things, but it's really interesting to hear everybody's point of view, and I hope to use what I've learned here. You know, there's a lot of motivation, and some of this, I want to eat better. When I go on McDonald's, I want to try to make better choices, and I hope to come back next year and say, well, we've implemented something else and have another program. We have, built a housing project that was green, or sold our organic buffalo on the grocery line or something like that. I'm 2 years in my first 4-year term, so there's a lot of stuff that could still be done, and I hope to do it, and I hope to learn from everybody around me.
Well, when you're last, they've said it all. And they really have, and I echo everything that's been said. This is, I think the key word that was mentioned was trust. Do we trust our neighbors to be able to share everything? And are you going to ask a question about leadership? On leadership? Okay, here we go. We talk about our youth and leaders. Leaders, in Greensburg, everybody was a leader. It took a real leadership and commitment to stay, to invest your life savings of emotion, physical life savings, spiritual life savings, and financial life savings to build back. Now that's real leadership. And to bring your business back and that kind of investment. But to share a quick story of how what we're going to pass on to future generations is, of these 9 grandchildren, they're always over at my garden all summer, watching the squash grow and picking tomatoes and just everything. And I got a 3-year-old granddaughter came up to me and said, "Papa, you're the best gardener ever." Yeah, it was emotional, but that's what we need to emulate to our youth, of how we do things, how we do the right, proper things, how we treat each other with dignity and respect, and teach those things to our youth. Not only how to be sustainable, how to know where our food comes from. And so when Sloane's eating that squash she picked from Bob's Green Giant Garden, she knows where it came from. And as I said earlier, I hope she tastes the love and the care that went into it. And I know they will.
Bob reads my mind, but the question is about the nature of leadership, and what do you all think you're seeing as the true challenge of leadership, and moving through what are very clearly difficult issues, but there's clearly an energy around trying to address them together. So what would you advise from your position on leadership?
From my point of view, is I have to talk to the departments that do these things. I have to go to their meetings. We had that land committee meeting that I could attend. I just think that you should just listen as much, maybe every now and then I have an idea of my own, but I guess just to listen.
Well, one of the things that, again, inspires me and encourages me is that in so many of our fields of leadership now, people are increasingly talking about the concept of humility. Because, none of us have the kinds of insights where we understand everything. So we have to reach out to others, to learn from others. And also, I think, even in the field of science now, we still see in the popular media the sense, well, what we're doing is based on sound science, and so the implication is you ought to shut up and not ask questions about it. We already settled that. But within the field of science now, that is rapidly being discarded because we realized that science is a process. And in fact, the head of the biology department at Columbia University published a book last year called Ignorance. It's what drives science. And he used as an analogy, which I love, he said, science is like looking for a black cat in a dark room. And then when you find that black cat, and you usually find it through sort of bumbling and, things that you didn't even think about looking for. But then when you find the black cat in the dark room, it opens the door for more black cats. And so scientists are beginning to realize that what they're engaged in is in a process of learning, and it's always what you don't know that drives us. It doesn't mean we don't. There's some things we know the earth is round, et cetera, et cetera. But many of the challenging issues that we're addressing in the future now, we don't have an answer for, so we have to constantly be exploring and inviting others to become involved in the exploration. And I'm also seeing that increasingly now in our community. Again, we all know we have some people, they think they know everything, and they've already settled things. They're not the leaders of the future. The leaders of the future are the ones that reach out to people in their communities, to people in their field of study, to whoever it is, and are open to conversations and learn from each other. And together, that's the way we're going to address the challenges of the future.
So going to what the challenges are of leadership. So of course we can all be leaders. Not everyone has to be up at the prow of the boat, pointing the direction. You've all heard the term leading from behind. You all have people in your lives that inspire you, even though they're not that sort of prototypical image of a leader. And in my conception, someone who leads is someone who actually makes a difference, particularly in difficult situations, with the definition of making a difference being that things are better for everyone, not just for the individual in question. Because leadership is conferred. You don't just anoint yourself with the mantle of leadership. It's recognized by others who see that you're effective in making things better for everyone. This nation, as everyone in this room knows, is navigating some very rough waters right now, and we actually have heard from some very positive folks here talking about what the points of optimism and possibility are. But we have to recognize that the nation is actually encountering difficulties because of the fact that we don't have many of the things that have been mentioned up here, namely trust. And there's arguments about who actually belongs in the country, who actually has a stake in the country, who has actually built this country. And I would remind everyone who's dealing with those sorts of questions, of the points that I made when beginning this morning. I think the key thing for us to solve in the future is whether we can live in a way that doesn't depend on us exploiting other people. And that the arguments that many of us have right now are actually disguised ways of saying, wait a minute, in the past I didn't have to deal with you because I actually displaced you to a more marginal place. Or in the past I didn't have to deal with you because I appropriated your labor and you didn't have the power to talk back to me. Or in the past I didn't actually have to deal with you because you were so desperate you were forced to do this work that I'm not willing to do for myself. And all of those people have built this country as much as anyone else in the history of the nation, and we need to recognize that. And that will make us stronger in the future. Not recognizing that has us locked in a very hateful cycle at the moment. So in the spirit of leadership, recognizing that and moving all of us in a way that's better for everyone involved, I think is one of the major challenges of our time.
I think all I would say is truth by consensus isn't truth, so leading by consensus isn't necessarily good leadership. You surround yourself with like-minded folks, it's easy to lead them in the wrong direction. In the realm of alternative, perhaps sustainable agriculture in particular, it's a cultural shift in many respects. True leaders will try new things, no matter what the table of truth might say at the local cafe. And they'll do it openly, they'll do it publicly, and they'll share everything they learn, not just the successes, but also the failures. A true leader will bring everybody else along with them for little or no personal profit or gain. And I think that's something that we'll need, and I see it happening here and there, but that's something that we'll absolutely need to get to that place where we need to be to ensure that my great-grandkids and their great-grandkids have a place to live on this earth.
My first job off the farm was the local cafe. I can really vouch for the coffee circle. 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. Questions from the audience?
Well, this will be a quick one. Hattie, do you sell food, source food into the casino, and do you feature it in terms of educational purposes?
The question is to Hattie if they sell their food into the casino and feature it for educational purposes.
Right now, no, we don't. We have, on the Buffalo Grill, we have buffalo burgers, but they're not ours. We had to go through a process to get USDA certified, and we're starting to build towards that, but right now we don't. I don't think we have any other produce or anything that's available over there, but we do have like local, people set up shop and cook, and you can buy anything on those areas, but that's the only places that we have our produce. And maybe every once in a while we have Buffalo donated. The Buffalo program does donate to ceremonies and celebrations, but those are, that's the only place I can see those things.
Questions? We have to raise high so I can see. Any questions out there? I have a question about diversification. Because at the Rural Center, we've really set a goal around diversifying what we're doing in agriculture, especially as our path to a more sustainable future. And I wanted to know, diversification is a good word, but it's really complex and hard to do. So I was curious from each of your vantage points, if that were to take place, what does it look like on the landscape and in our communities?
Gee whiz, in a minute? No. So from my standpoint, I think diversification is a good business practice because all your eggs aren't in one basket, quite literally. If you take a look at any environmental system out there, you'll notice that it's very diverse. It's probably even more diverse than the scope of sort of human analysis can really grasp. And if you look at your farm, if we're talking about farming and food, and that's kind of my role, I think, on this panel. If you look at your place as a system of incredible diversity that you might not be able to really understand, I think you can work better with it and probably find even more and more sustainable profit centers from it if you actually embrace it, as opposed to trying to wrangle it into one or two or three principal profit centers, and leaving the rest to either languish or go to waste or whatnot.
I'm actually going to expand my question, and then you can take it back if you want, Professor. An elephant in the room seems to me to be that if you've capitalized your whole business around large combines and large operations where you're really specialized around one or two crops or 3 or 4, that leap from that to a more diversified, tiered, sort of stacked operation with a lot of variety in it seems insurmountable, but is it?
I think another really good question, and I think that's a place where there's really great opportunity for you, that big producer with a huge investment in monoculture, basically. There's no doubt that you've got areas that are a pain for you to work. There's no doubt that you've got areas that you can't capitalize because your system won't really allow it, and that gives you an opportunity to invite younger folks in to try a free-range poultry project on that little piece of grassland that you just can't cope with, or to grow some high-value vegetables in those goofy-shaped fields where there's too many point rows.
I'll make an economic point and then an agronomic point about this. So there's an economist at the University of Maine who, by name is Stu Smith, who several years ago was doing a stint in DC. He was the economist for the Joint Economic Committee of Congress. And one of his tasks was to figure out what the allocation of all of the money within agriculture was, and so he divided up the pie into 3 different sectors. And so one of the sectors was basically the input sector, everyone that's providing you the seeds, the machinery, the chemicals. The other was the farming sector, the people that actually use those inputs to drive production. And then the third sector is the folks that buy that, process it, and then turn it into agricultural products and food. And that he referred to as the marketing sector. So the shorthand is input, production, marketing. And for a period of 100 years, he tracked what had been happening with each of those sectors, and he did this proportionally, because obviously the size of the pie, the amount of money in agriculture has been increasing over that period of time, so he took proportions. So over that period of time, you won't be surprised to learn that the proportion of money in agriculture that was going to inputs increased. But at the time that he did this study, which is in severe need of updating, it's about 15 years old now, but at the time that he did this study, the input sector had climbed to be about 20% of all the income in agriculture. And then the marketing sector also had been increased, and it's actually the largest sector in agriculture, buying, processing, transporting, selling. That had gone to about 57%. So some 57% and 20, and you see the sector that belonged to farming. The interesting thing was that that wedge had been decreasing throughout the 100 years that he'd been taking a look at. So he titled his article, which you can find in Choices magazine, very provocatively. He said, farming, it's declining. And he did the thing that any economist would do. I've seen the raw data, and they do jump around, but he just basically linearized that. He did an extrapolation, said, when will these 2 lines meet? And that would be 2020, when those 2 lines met. And what he said about that, that's when farming will disappear. Now, you may think that that is just a ridiculous premise, but in the sense in which farming would disappear, what he meant was that the integration between all of those 3 sectors would be such that either input or marketing or both would own the production function, so that those would essentially just be salaried people, it would just be paid people that would be loading wagons, loading seeds, and that sort of thing, not actually independent entrepreneurs out there. So he predicted that by the year 2020, this would have occurred. And you know what this looks like out there on the land. So it looks like, you are actually a contracted farmer. You agree to all of the specifications for production. And now, one thing that Stu did not factor in is that we'll get pretty close to that, but won't get all the way there. And the reason being that the single riskiest place of the entire operation is what you do outdoors, where in 5 seconds or 20 seconds, you can lose it all. And neither input or marketing is going to take that risk. And in fact, it's impossible for any of the folks in production to take on that risk. That's what we agreed to do. Whether we recognize it or not, we're partnering in order to absorb that risk so that we can eat. But we don't live in boom and bust cycles. Now, what does this have to do with diversity? A very smart Iowa farmer once told me, it used to be that we leveraged somebody else's money to farm. You'd go to bank, get what it cost you to buy the inputs, and then at the end of the season, if you were lucky, then you would be able to pay back and live some. And he says that now what it's turned into is we're leveraging somebody else's knowledge as well. The smarts are somewhere else. You just have to find the right technology package. You buy that, you apply that. And that could be anyone. And if you think that that's an exaggeration, the future that is behind us, and you just need to open up any farming magazine. And the culture of farming since the 1950s has been you succeed first and the most if you're the first to adopt the technology that's out there, apply it, and then you will do well. The system will reward you for that. So open up any farming magazine. The future looks like this. Whoever's operating that is actually off in front of a screen someplace. The operations are mechanized, robotized. Everything's been mapped, digitized, and so there's satellites that are actually predicting what the weather is going to be, what the applications need to be. There are drones and self-propelled machinery that's out there doing everything. That's the future that's drawn for us. That's the example of somebody else's money and somebody else's intelligence. And farmers truly would have disappeared from that. Now, the equivalent would be the folks that are out there basically managing capital resources, basically hedging it all on the fact that they've modeled everything correctly and that things will turn out well, leveraging public resources, government resources, and so on. Well, is there a way to escape from that where you're essentially just a cog in that? And so for me, that's where diversity comes in. So now let me turn to agronomists. So, there's this marvelous thing about thinking in three space. Fred yesterday mentioned, am I going really long here? Okay, you'll tolerate it here. Fred mentioned yesterday Justus von Liebig, who had essentially created the paradigm for input-dependent agriculture. And around that period of time, a lot of really important patterns were being put into place in agriculture. It's a period of time also when there's a lot of migration and settlement from Europe into the United States. So what was then current was brought to the United States as the very latest technology. And one of the things that had been going on was that there had been a prominent gentleman farmer in England who trialed what was then, literally, the title of his book was The Newfangled Horse-Hoeing Husbandry. The gentleman's name is Jethro Tull. And this individual was highly motivated. This may sound familiar to you. He was highly motivated to figure out a way in which he could replace the labor on his farm. He really looked down on the labor. They were costly. He thought that they were lazy, and horses seemed to be the way to replace the labor on his farm. And he was a gentleman farmer, so he trialed several different ways of utilizing the horses. But the common thing was that he needed space in the grain crops that he grew, primarily wheat, also barley and oats. He needed space for the horses to get through. Prior to that, all of those grain crops were basically broadcast. You had a solid set of those crops. Weeds were undefined because there was no ecological niche where they expressed. As a matter of fact, the oat crop was originally a weed in those crops that turned into a useful crop. So those rows originated then. And one of the studies that Jethro Tull did, to Fred's point about finding a black cat in a dark room, was that he had this theory. You can find this in this book. It's a fascinating entry in it. He had this theory that in essence you had to pulverize soil to make it fertile because, don't you know, what was going on was that these tiny little mouths and roots were actually absorbing soil particles, so the more finely ground the soil was, then the better able to digest that fertility the plants would be. And furthermore, he figured out that if you actually did that well, you could replace manures, which he thought was just a horrible idea. He thought that here you would be putting this into the soil, the plant would be taking it up, and then you would be eating it, you'd be eating manure. It was just a repellent idea. So to him, it was all about pulverizing the soil because that made it fertile. And the proof to him, this is the black cat, was that he took these grain crops, which formerly had been broadcast, put them into rows. He was one of the people that invented what today we would call grain drills in order to facilitate that. And what he discovered was that he got greater yield. Now, as an agronomist, we can tell you now that the reason for that was that in rows there was more space between the plants. They tillered more, therefore you got more seed head, therefore you got more seed, which is the thing that he was harvesting. That was the reason for that. But he interpreted that his theory that the more pulverized the soil was, the more fertile it was, and therefore the more productive the plants were. And that was the rage. When farmers settled this country, that's what they brought. You plant in rows, where formerly you had broadcast, you pulverize the soil, you don't recycle the manure. That's what the state-of-the-art of agriculture was when all of your forebears began to settle this place. Now, that's why we have rows, and that's why we have monoculture to an extent. It's not as simple as that, but it was a huge influence. Now, here's the question. In three space, you can do marvelous things. So you can have a crop, and this is ancient human knowledge. You can have a crop that grows in the soil, say a peanut. You can have a crop that grows on the surface of the soil, has big, broad, thick green leaves that doesn't need a whole lot of light, like we've heard squashes and pumpkins mentioned here. In that field, you can have corn growing tall with strong stems that reach out into the light. You can have climbing vines of beans that grow in that same field. You fill all of those same niches. What you produce there is automatically a mix of diverse food from the outset. And you might think, well, that's fine for small-scale farmers off someplace. but I've got mechanization. I'm a modern farmer. That's not going to work. And I was once in a discussion with a prominent ag engineer at Iowa State by the name of Wes Buckley. Some of you, if you're old enough, may know of Wes. He was one of the persons that actually developed, the large bales and the equipment to harvest these large bales, the round bales. And when he heard another agronomist, fortunately it wasn't me, but when he heard another agronomist saying, it's just too complicated. Now we're modern, we're mechanized, we need these rows, we need homogeneity so we can harvest all this stuff. He bristled. He literally bristled. He was a large man, and so when he bristled, we all do it. And he basically said, young man, says, all I need, just give me two things that I can do to discriminate what you want me to get out of the field. Tell me what you want in that field, and I can go with size, I can go with height, I can go with weight, I can go with color. There's any number of ways that I can get what you want out of that field. We can go through that field 3 different times and get 3 different things that you want. Or I can go through that field once and get the 3 different things that you want. So you worry about designing the system, I'll get you the machine that you need. It's basically his message. And that was a little bit, I can't imitate Wes, but he came across with power. So the moment you hear that the machinery is in the way, that's not it. It's imagination, it's will, it's determination, it's knowing your business, really knowing agriculture and what you can really do out there. I'll say one last thing about this. These 3-dimensional systems, we as agronomists have a way of asking the question. Suppose you're growing 3 things in there. Suppose that the other way that you could get those 3 things is to have an acre each of one of those in monocrop. Are you more productive or less productive if you plant them together? Well, ecologically, if you pick the right species and they complement each other and don't compete for light, water within that 3-dimensional canopy, you can get greater productivity. It's all in the mix that you choose. So you can't make the blanket statement that you'll always produce more, but if you choose the right mixes, you can get up to 6 times more productivity per unit of land. So it is not the case that productivity is limiting agriculture. It is the case that we could do more with the resources that we have right now with ingenuity. So now let me close the cycle. If we reward management and the knowledge of managers that know their land, know their ecology, know what they're doing, we don't need to depend as much on the input sector. We can deal with that narrowing wedge that is squishing that sector, which is the most important one of those 3.
Good luck with you. Do you want to speak to diversification?
Well, the other thing about, and everything that Ricardo said is exactly on target. The other thing about diversification we have to keep in mind is that as we move into the future now, we're not going to have all of the cheap inputs that enabled us to do the specialization. Because without those, they're not going to work. So you're going to have more diversity. And the other thing is with climate change, you're going to not have these uniform kinds of climates, etc., where you can do the same thing in every place in the world. And if you want to read a really good book that addresses all of this, Gary Paul Navan's book, Where Our Food Comes From, where he goes into some detail, Russian plant breeder, Nikolai Babalov. He was a plant breeder back in the early 1900s, and he had gone around the world to collect diversity of seeds because he saw those diversity as so you could apply them to different places to be productive in different places. And the end of that story is kind of interesting because it was just at the time when Russian politicians were moving in the industrial direction, and so they saw what Nikolai Babalov was doing, was standing in the way of that, and actually threw him into prison where he starved to death. It's one of those ironies that you just can't hardly believe. But nevertheless, the point that Gary Paul Navin makes from all of this is that as we move into our future now, and it's a future we have largely eliminated a lot of the diversity. We've, over the last 50 years, we've lost, I think he says about 3/4 of our plant varieties and about 1/3 of our animal breeds. But as we go into the future now, we're going to have these different local ecologies, all of which are going to require different kinds of seeds and breeds in order to thrive well. So we now need to really begin to restoring our biological diversity and genetic diversity rather than simplifying it, because that's going to be an essential part of the future. And I think that's an important lesson to keep in mind in all of this.
You want to add anything? If you don't have to,
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. Each one of us have talents, and each one of us have less than talents. Diversification is great, but there's nothing wrong with doing what you do and doing it well, as long as you're not a slave to the financial institutions and the inputs coming in. And once you get caught in that game, and I did back in the late 70s and early 80s in the farming business, and that's why I'm no longer in farming. I like to say I made my fortune farming, and my mind goes back, oh no, the banker sold me out. Because I wasn't diversified enough, and I was trying to do something that wasn't in my talent. And almost I got too diversified, thinking the more diversified I was going to get, the better I would be, when I ended up doing nothing well. So do what you do well, and then apply that diversification. That might be a different point of view from all of you, but I really feel that way. Yes, we need to be diversified, but within your capacity.
I think that's what we do as a tribe. I mean, but we don't really branch out as much. We do our staples, and we're still growing as our economic development, but we are a government, not so much enterprise, so I struggle with balancing that, because, we mow the lawns of the elders, we help gravel the roads, and these things don't have income coming back. So I'm somewhere in between. I'm not sure how much diversified we get, because it's not always about the bottom line with the government, but we do want to maximize the services that we're getting. So I don't have any answers for that, but we are trying to find what could work, but it's kind of slow moving for the government, because we want to make sure it works before we actually step out. So that's why it's kind of, I'm more negative on diversification, but we do what we do well, and that's what has got us to this point.
Oh, I've got a question.
I have one question here, but Ricardo's headed to the airport.
Okay.
Let's hear your question, and thank you, Ricardo.
I just,
Fred can stay for one more, and then he's headed out.
I've been really struggling for the last 20 years trying to understand the relationship between population density and sustainability. Like that would be urban, rural, or whichever. I've gone back and forth between all of them. If folks could speak to that a little bit.
Your question is, you're struggling with the relationship between
The concept of population density, cities, rural, villages, farm, and sustainability. I don't know how many people you need to have a sustainable culture, how you're going to work that when oil gets to be where it's going to be. I don't know if anybody wants to talk about that. It's just been going in my mind for the last 40 years, but I didn't know if anybody else is dealing with that.
So how do we balance population needs with sustainability needs across the landscape when they're very variable?
Is there a density of population to where things start to make more sense, And
Yeah. Is there a density where things make sense?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that helps.
Are you guys good?
I don't have a whole lot to say, I don't think about that. That's going to be really intelligent, but I think about it a lot. But I would say this, no, there is not, for any one given place, any one given ecosystem or ecotype. Obviously the density in the desert is going to be lower than the density in the northeast of this country, or something like that, at least in terms of what the earth can sustain. That's my thinking on it. In terms of a global scale, I'm sure there's some number, but it's not going to be applicable as that average number in every location, to my way of looking at it. Yeah, I believe it's totally localized. Yeah.
Well, yeah, again, we have I talked about this a little bit yesterday. We've kind of tended to ignore the whole issue of population density, like all we got to do is find out a way to feed everybody, and then everything's going to be fine. And it's not the way nature functions. So what we have to pay attention to, I think, is what is an appropriate population, and the kind of, again, the key thing here is, as Alder Leopold said, the capacity of the biotic community, the capacity of nature to renew itself. And that self-renewal is only possible when you have the kind of complexity and interreaction and supportive systems for, in nature, everything's connected, and so there are these interrelationships. So it's the proper interrelationships that sustain the health of the whole. And as he pointed out, whenever in nature you have one kind of species that exceeds its density in terms of that kind of self-renewing, emerging complexity, then it starts to hurt the whole system, and then nature finds a way to reduce that density to get it back into balance again. So I think, again, it's one of those areas where we need to pay a lot more attention to the whole health of the biotic community, including the microbes, which are, foundational to everything. And again, one of the things that encourages me is that in so many fields of study now, we have people increasingly looking at the microbiome and what role is that playing in the health of the whole system. And ultimately, we're simply homes for the microbes. And so our own health, becomes involved in that as well. So I think those are the kinds of issues that we have to pay attention to. And so it's not just, and there isn't any standard density that you have to, keep certain populations of, whether it's deer or humans or whatever else, but it's appropriate to the place, to the local ecology, and what then enables that to be in a self-renewing capacity.
I really don't have much to add, but yeah, I think nature has a way to balance out, and we just gotta trust her to do her job.
I think that makes a great final statement, actually. So we're gonna let you all go take a break before the final sessions of the day. The silent auction, Jennifer is positioned back here. We said it was going to close at 2. Should we consider it closed? 10 more minutes, the 2:15 break. That's what Jennifer's giving us. So if you have a final bidding war situation, you better head that way. There's no fist fights. And we're going to regather in here at 3:45 to send home the auction items, and we have a snack with some closing remarks. We need to eat again. Brief, so food in here at 3:45. Smoothies in the corners with pines. I can hear it going.